My name's Nick Badminton. I'm a futurist. I help my clients look out 5, 10, 20, 30, even 50 plus years ahead so we can make better decisions today. We can start to anticipate risk. We can start to be curious about the futures that are ahead of us. And this keynote is called Facing Our Futures. And I've just written a book called Facing Our Futures. It just came out last week. I'm going to be doing a book signing after the second keynote this morning, and 32 books from North Vancouver are over there, great independent bookstore. So do come down, I'll be doing some book signings, and that's a lot of fun, so thank you very much. But this keynote is about starting to become curious and wondering what comes next. And I think this is my 9th year of speaking at this conference. So in the last 9 years, I think I've done 7 or 8 keynotes and been inside rooms. So this is the first time on the main stage. But this keynote is about curiosity. It's about igniting new ways of thinking about our futures and bringing that back to our strategic planning today. Now, when I was 8 years old, I was given a book, the Usborne Book of the Future, and it imagined a world in the year 2000, technology everywhere, home robots, wearable computing, the Hyperloop, we'd be living under the sea, we'd be living on the moon, we'd be traveling in spaceships around the Earth. We didn't quite make it. But cut forward to a few decades ahead, I've written a book called Facing Our Futures, which really starts to frame some of the biggest challenges that we have in the world, and I'm going to talk about them today. And what we can do to try and imagine our way forward so we can be strategically more powerful today. So the futures thinking and foresight that I do is sort of captured in that book. So do check that out. But we've kind of found ourselves in a bit of a pickle. So the last 300 years of industrial revolutions have been celebrated. You know, new food systems and agriculture at scale has been the reason we've been able to grow population and GDP and city size and a number of other things. We've got the mega cities that are starting to spring up around the world, and we've got technology that's running faster than ever before, and new technologies are really inspiring people to do new things. I'm going to talk about all of this and the dynamics between them, but we're kind of on life support today. You know, in futures work, we talk about different states of being, and one of them is collapse. I feel that we're in a constant state of collapse, and we're continually trying to renew that, trying to fix it, maintain it. We're kind of in a bad situation. Why is that? Well, the bad situation has been caused by a sort of a limited view of what futures is, or the future. So as futurists, we don't predict anything, so there's no predictions in this keynote. This is about thinking about futures, plural. So always think about the multitude of futures that are ahead of us. Everyone in the room has got a different path forward from today into the next 20, 50, 100 plus years. So we have to think about that strategically as well, especially around privacy and security and autonomy and what that means for really protecting what we hold dear. But some companies are just not very good at looking at futures or accepting that things would change. I like talking about Kodak at this moment, right? Hands up who's actually taken a photo with a camera that's actually contained some Kodak film in it in the last year. Everyone's like, me, I've done it. In the last year, how many people? Okay, people are into photography, fantastic. There's about 8.5 million cameras sold a year, like proper cameras. About 12% of them have got film in them. 1986, you had Kodak, 145,000 employees. By the mid-90s, they owned 2/3 of the global market share in terms of cameras and film. And by the mid-20s, they were bankrupt. In the 70s, a guy called Steve Sasson was working in an R&D lab, and he had an idea about digital photography. You know, computing was getting underway. Personal computing was starting to really gain some pace. Kodak execs weren't paying attention. So Steve went through his laboratory and picked up things like, a digital cassette from a mainframe computer. He picked up like lenses, put it all together. And he showed that we could capture digital imagery. And he took this in to the big bosses in Kodak and said, look what I've done. And they said, that's cute, don't tell anyone. And it was probably one of the biggest mistakes that they made, because they were so married to their business model of selling film, processing film, all the chemicals that go with that, that industry was always going to work that way, that they ignored probably the biggest revolution in so many different parts of society in the world, and with big impacts on privacy and security, right? Luckily, Steve Sasson and the team in Kodak, they patented this, and by proxy, they made billions of dollars, whilst everyone else was jumping on board with the technology. And then where's Kodak today, right? So that's a story about a lack of futures thinking. Now, the R&D department and the engineer could see what was coming, but the bosses couldn't believe that was going to be the way and things were going to change. Now, Steve couldn't predicted what happens today. 1.6 billion smartphones are sold every year, and everyone's got a digital camera, right? If Kodak would have even imagined that, they would have been still here and probably one of the biggest companies in the world. And this is the problem. We have a collective poverty of imagination. When we're kids, and I've got a 2.5-year-old, imagination is literally everything about our lives. And we can play, and we can interact, we can come up with stories, imaginary characters. And then as we go through school, it's sort of beaten out of us. And then when we work, whether it's in government or private companies or public companies, we're told to work hard, come up with good ideas, stay in our boxes, and don't really push the boundaries of what can be. The poverty of imagination is destroying our ability to be innovative. And as futures practitioners, we really try to dial up the imagination and curiosity that we need and sort of try and restart that in organizations, and that's what I do with my company, the Futurist.com think tank. So we've got a number of different people that have got decades of experience doing futures work, from all the way back from the late 60s. But what we do is we scan for signals and we look for new trends. And that's kind of what this keynote's about. There's no predictions. This is about scenarios and ideas and speculations of what comes next. And we also dive into stories, and I'll cover that a little bit later in the keynote. But what's been really interesting is that there's been a narrative saying futures is interesting, it's kind of useful, it adds some flavor to our strategic planning. That's great. But about 4 years ago, we had a study come out by Rohrbeck and Kuhn that found out that companies that had a high level of future preparedness, which meant that they had vigilance, they did work around scanning, building trends, looking at scenarios, writing stories, imagining these new worlds ahead of us so we could be a part of that. These companies have got 33% higher profit and a 200% higher growth than the people that did not. And when we talk about futures, you either do the work and you have a say in what those futures look like, or you sit back and you're still implicated in futures, you just don't have a role. So what do you want to be? What part of our futures dynamics do we want to be a part of? Do we want to be bystanders? Do we want to watch people? And this comes to helping us shift our mindsets. So when I speak to executives, I talk about shifting the mindset from what is to what if. So operationally, what we have to do, super important, not taken away from that. But then wondering, what if the world changes entirely? What if entire industries were to disappear? Your competition gets stronger. You lose market share. Tech companies go mayhem with technology and capturing data and corporate surveillance and all the things that we're worried about as well. What if we embrace curiosity in our futures? And that's the big question that I ask all executives that I work with. So this keynote is going to be really fun. I'm going to cover a few areas, and I'm going to start with geopolitics because that's something that I think that every single organization and groups of people in professions like privacy and security really need to get a handle on. So we're going to go at some pace, okay? Economics. So by 2030, they think that China's going to be #1 economic power, followed by India, followed by the US. Generally, when I'm down in the US and show this slide, it upsets a lot of people. I mean, China and India, huge populations. That we know that there's a power dynamic shift to the east. It's already started to happen. There's also a power dynamic shift to Africa. The median age of an African today is 18 years old. You've got cities like Lagos, Nigeria, that are going to be 55 million people by 2050, 88 million people by 2100. closely followed by Kolkata, Mumbai, and other places. No cities in North America are growing like that. Africa is going to be probably one of the most important places in the next sort of 150 years in terms of how the world is shaped and changed. And I say more power to them. Then we're going to have energy dynamics changing. So we're going to have a global energy supergrid, the Internet of Energy. And we've already seen the dynamics of change and conflict and Russia and Ukraine and turning off gas to Eastern Europe and a whole bunch of stuff. Imagine if we've suddenly got these large countries like China and Russia, US and Canada, generating energy and trading that in real time around the world like we share data around the world. And imagine the geopolitical strife and theater that's going to happen there, right? The decentralization of energy is going to be hugely important. The global energy grids are also going to be a dynamic that's going to really, make our lives tough. What's the privacy and security of energy? It's an interesting question. Microchips. Was it 92% of the world's most advanced microchips are made in Taiwan by TSMC? ABC, anything but China. There's a whole dynamic around this that's playing out. So I'm watching that really, really carefully. And CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Chaos. This is a strange time for geopolitics. There are people in the world in democracies that are trying to drive the world forward. There are people within democracies that are trying to cause mayhem and chaos. And chaos is trying to be undertaken across the world by these actors and other people. But CRINC is something that we have to pay attention to because these are going to get a lot stronger together, and Saudi and other countries as well in the Middle East. So what if we anticipate global dynamics and how those new global dynamics really start to shape the dialogue and change around the world? We know that this can happen. The world that's created today comes from new global dynamics being created like 50, 60, even 100 years ago. And then when the World Economic Forum did its risk report for the year, they introduced a word called polycrisis, which means multiple crises coming together and interacting. So everything from climate change and the water, energy, food nexus and waste and a whole number of different dynamics. When these come together, they create a bigger problem than they're created on their own. And we saw this coming. Again, we've not been very good at listening to people that have been kind of speculating on what comes forward. In the early 70s, the Club of Rome wrote The Limits to Growth. And they looked at resources and food per capita, population pollution, industrial output. And they said, you know what, we're going to run out of the ability to survive on this planet in any way that's good for humanity by 2100. And when I watched some of the footage of this being shown on TV and people showing the computer simulation, this was run in a computer simulation in MIT. And so it's really interesting to see how this kind of more qualitative side of futures has been played out. But we've ignored that. Fossil fuel companies have ignored that. Governments have ignored that. We've been trolling along through the 80s and prosperity and a whole number of different things. And Gaia Harrington, a researcher, she works at KPMG now, she redid this study and went through the data and reran everything a couple of years ago. And it's not 2100 we need to be worried about. She actually speculates it's going to be 2040. So here we go. That's less than 20 years in our futures, so we have to pay attention. We have to be aware that climate change is very real. Our planet is warming. The chaos of weather that we're seeing around the planet is caused by that warming. The Anthropocene, the world of humans and technology and biology and the effects that all has together. These are the climate strikes from the University of Reading. It's interesting, Reading football clubs actually got these on the sleeves of their football jerseys. And we've got commentators on British television now talking about climate change to the avid supporters of Reading Football Club. I think they need some hope at Reading Football Club, by the way. I used to live there. Last year, and talking about people not believing what might come, last year I went down to Florida, went to Boca Raton, 5-star resort, big conference, people that build educational facilities, really cool bunch of people. And I spoke about a number of different things, and when I spoke about climate, I spoke about Florida's potential future and some scenarios around that. What if the global warming got to 2 degrees? What would southern Florida look like? Well, because of the porous rock and because of the oceans rising, and it's already risen about 18 inches over the last 30, 40 years, just around Florida, we're going to see a lot of flooding. At 4 degrees, and let's hope that we don't get to 4 degrees, you've almost lost the whole of southern Florida to the ocean. And one of the board members of this organization said, we'll just call the Dutch. Because the Dutch have done a really good job with like shoring up their coastlines. Well, it's a different geology, and it's a different political landscape, and there's a whole number of other things. It's not going to be that way. People are saying that Miami is not going to exist in any way by 2100. And then about 3 months after this, and I was at another conference in Las Vegas, the people were from Florida, they were running the conference, they couldn't go home for 7 days because most of their homes were underwater because of what DeSantis called a 1,000-year event, the storm. 1,000-year event? Yeah, see you in 2 or 3 years. It's going to get interesting, right? And we're not listening, but we need voices on big stages saying that, we need to pay attention. Futurism is activism, and that's what we really need to embrace. And we've got some people in the world that do a good job at that.
There is no planet B. There is no planet blah. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us?
A young woman standing up to power, really calling out what is actually the truth. Futurism is activism. We need more of that. We need our kids to stand up. We all need to stand up and do that as well. So what if we get serious about poly solutions for the poly crisis that we've got? Multiple solutions working together as countries around the world, trying to work out what's going to work the best. How can we be resilient? Because some of these problems and challenges are coming. How can we survive going forward? Then I like to talk about simulation on occasion. Who believes that we're living in a simulation? There's like one person, 2 people. Cool. Technology and religion and everything's coming together, and suddenly it's like, are we really living in a simulation? It's like the mice in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The planet Earth is just a big computer, and it says the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42. And it's like, what's the question? Well, I need to go and work out what the question is now, right? But simulation has been bandied around by various billionaires, and like, are we living in a simulation or not? I don't believe that we are living in a simulation, so cool. But it's interesting to play with these ideas. William Gibson lives on the North Shore here. And if you ever get a chance to see him speak at any event in Vancouver, I saw him at Vancouver Public Library, he's an amazing thinker. And he wrote this a number of decades ago. Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation. Kind of sounds like TikTok, right? Sounds like our current world. This is someone in the 80s speculating on what computing could be, a great futurist, a speculator of our current dilemma. Then in the early 90s, we saw the internet, the public internet, pop up. And we saw people like Josh Harris, who's the subject of this amazing film by Ondi Timmer called We Live in Public, do an experiment in New York called Quiet. He took a number of people down into a bunker under New York City, and they had all the food and all the drink and a gun range, and they had these pods, and they had cameras, and there was like interrogation. It was very scary. And he captured all the footage. That's what he owned. We were the product for the first time in the early days of the internet. It's kind of a model that's been embraced by YouTube and a number of other platforms, where we are literally reduced to the product. But Josh Harris was just really waving a flag and speculating on what comes next. And there are some really great designers around the world really sort of putting up their hands and saying, hey, the world is potentially going to be different. As we move away from the rectangles in our pockets, smartphones, to head-worn devices, augmented reality, which is probably still a few years away, there's lots of difficult tech challenges to solve. What's that world going to look like in terms of data, interaction, and our identity in that world?
Estoy libre de mi ira, estoy libre de mi tristeza, el amor es mi esperanza.
Habla español, niña, que vaya con
Adiós.
Hola, yo soy María.
Bueno. Hola otra vez. Ay, no, cállate.
This is future storytelling. This is speculative fiction. Keiichi Matsuda took him and his team down to Medellin, Colombia. They took all the footage. They took it back in post-production, built this incredible world. It's a video called Hyperreality, and it takes us on a journey with this woman down in Medellin, Colombia, as she goes through a number of different dilemmas of being part of this technologically entrenched world. It's about 8 minutes long. You should totally watch that video because there's some interesting twists from a privacy and security and cybersecurity perspective at the end. Has anyone heard of a campaign called Birds Aren't Real? A young guy down in the States about 5 years ago started a campaign to empower Gen Z by saying, we're living in a world of ridiculous misinformation. I'm going to build this platform called Birds Aren't Real, and we're going to have protests across the United States. We're going to have billboards. We're going to go on TV. We're going to create our own misinformation theater. And they've been incredibly successful. About 2 million social followers. There's independent chapters growing all around the US. It's like Fight Club, right? It's interesting. This guy has suddenly gone and said, hey, there's misinformation, and everyone's been confused. They don't know whether to believe him or not. He claims that 12 billion birds in the 80s were killed and repurposed to be flying bird drones that undertake surveillance on a daily basis. Hands up who believes that? Yeah. Ironically, I read an article earlier this year. They're actually taking dead birds and building them into surveillance kind of things for nature expeditions. And there's bird-shaped drones in certain parts of the world. It's kind of interesting. But that misinformation and what we're talking about in terms of the internet and capturing all that data, are we living in a simulation? No, but it kind of feels like we're being reduced to that. And it's not our choice because we sign the terms and conditions away, right? What if we focus on our humanity and our reality? I think that's really important. And then in futures work, I talk about possible futures. I talk about dystopian trajectories, how bad it could get if we make bad decisions today. That's what the book's about. But we also talk about utopia. And utopia, if you translate it literally means no place. This is not a place that can exist. But there's lots of people that are speculating that we can create this. It's a soother for modern humanity and the challenges that we face. Amazing thinker Jack Fresco, rest in peace, from the Venus Project. A new kind of socioeconomic model around resources, equality, wealth distribution. Really, really cool ideas. But still a little bit pie in the sky, a little bit utopian. But now we're finding ourselves in a world where other people are trying to promise that because they're trying to create a new version of our future that we can be a little happier in. Now, in Saudi Arabia, we've probably seen lots of the information coming out about NEOM, the new city they want to build, fantastic. It's kind of exciting to imagine these new futuristic cities built from the ground up. They've got the line, 170 kilometers long. They've broken ground on this. This is an area where you can live and you can survive. Glass walls, amazing in the desert. It's kind of building a bunker for mega billionaires to take all their money and to put it in Saudi Arabia. Because in the next 50 years, they're not going to be making that much money from oil like they make today, right? Saudi Aramco, most profitable company in the world. And then I love stories on the flip side of that. The same people that are like preppers. South Dakota, this is a company called VIPSS. 550 plus bunkers that were originally used for military use. And people are buying them to survive in the middle of America because of the polycrises that are coming, the challenges that we're coming, right? And a different kind of version of utopia, a utopia that we hide in. And it's interesting when we think about utopia, it was a term created in the 15th century. Dystopia was a term created about 200 years later, because people don't really like talking about, bad trajectories to our futures. But utopia is sort of a null and void term today, and we have to really focus on real life places and people. And this keynote, as you're probably noticing, is more about raising questions than it is about giving you any solutions. And that's what futures work is all about. It's literally about awakening the imagination and getting to ask, what if? So we've been stuck in this sort of short-term cycle, whether that's an election cycle, whether that's CEOs in the US on average being rewarded for long-term performance at 1.3 years. There's a problem, right? We don't look far enough ahead. But there's also a term called Longtermism where people are saying their solutions decades out, and it kind of numbs us a little bit to our challenges today. We keep doing the same thing. But long-term thinking is incredibly important. Now, we've probably heard the phrases black swan and black elephant, right? So a black swan, unknowns, unknowns, unknown unknowns. Right? We just don't know what it is and when it's coming. It's like a meteorite hitting Vancouver. Or the big earthquake that's going to come to the west coast of the US and Canada, right? Now, a lot of people were saying that the pandemic, COVID-19, was a black swan. It wasn't. We've known that pandemics happen. Spanish flu, Hong Kong flu, SARS, MERS, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19. There's about 7.5 million coronaviruses in nature. Some will be zoonotic and some will jump to humans. Yay. COVID-23. No, let's not do that. But they're black elephants. They stand in the room, they look at us, you know that they're going to cause mayhem, but we close our eyes and we don't pay attention because it's inconvenient. Countries imagined what that would be like, and they came up with entire plans to save the country and to really reduce harm from pandemics. And a lot of those countries ignored that, which is wild to me. And some countries did pay attention to it. Now, some of the tools that we use in futures work, and I'm not going to go too much into tools in this keynote at all. I mentioned them in the book, plug. Things like James Data's University of Hawaii Manoa School. He talks about, 4 alternative futures: continuation, limits and discipline, and then decline and collapse and transformation. And we imagine different states of what those futures may be like, and we tell stories, put scenarios, people, places, dynamics, and we try and play that against each other. Ultimately, we're finding the limits and discipline all the time, and we're trying to transform our way out of that. And I think we're doing an okay job, but we can do better. What's interesting is there's a virtuous cycle here of disruption and despair, because as we hit those moments of collapse, or that ongoing drone of collapse that we see in certain parts of society around water, energy, and food, then we have to try and transform our own mental state out of that so we can start to build these big solutions in the world looking forward. Now, how do I do what I do? So I get asked this a lot, and feel free to scan this QR code on stage, or you can go to futurist.com/VIPSS, And you can go there, and it gives you a number of steps that you can take to start priming your thinking. You are futurists. You can be futurists on a daily basis. It sets up automated alerts on signals and trends that you're interested in. It's really powerful, and it's a quick way of really getting on top of what's happening, because you can scan for signals in an automated fashion. Every day you can ask yourself a number of questions like, what if the world changes? What are the dynamics of regulation affects privacy and security in whole new ways in Canada and abroad? What if there's new technological platforms that have a higher degree of equity and ownership and data dignity? And then there's part of this which is we can anticipate horizons. What does that look like? Actually, if you wake up every morning and you just scan some of these signals that will be delivered in your inbox, and they're not delivered from me, they're delivered from the wider world, it helps you just ask some of these questions and anticipate what might happen next. It's better for setting regulation. It's better for setting information policy, for really empowering the citizens that are affected by systems and the data that's being collected. And it's empowering for every organization around the planet. So, what if we embrace curiosity in our futures? Brings me back to the beginning. What if we ignite curiosity? What if we strive to be good citizens of the world, responsible for shaping what our futures are like, instead of sitting back and waiting for the future to happen to us? This keynote is literally asking tons of questions and trying to say, okay, shift your mindset from what is to what if. Try and unlock some new superpowers where you can link disruption and despair to strategy. And that's the superpower of foresight and futures thinking. I would love to take some questions. Thank you so much.